Good morning to everyone. Dr. C Rangarajan, Madam Shobharani SSV, Chairperson IFHE Society, distinguished faculty, my dear students, alumni, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to say a few words about Dr. Rangarajan for the benefit of large number of students who are attending this class. Dr. Rangarajan, the Chancellor of the University, is a leading economist who has played a key role both as an academic and as a policy maker in India. He has held several important positions, which include Governor of Reserve Bank of India and Governor of United States of Andhra Pradesh and Chairman Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. Having obtained his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, he taught at the Wharton School of Finance and Commerce, the Graduate School of Business Administration in New York University, and the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He was for a time fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C. As the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India during 92 to 97, he was instrumental in successfully launching far-reaching financial sector reforms. He has published many research papers and books in economics, finance, and banking, including a book on Tracking the Indian Economy, a collection of articles published by IUP Publications, a division of ICFAI Society, available with Amazon. He was honored with Padma Vibhushan in the year 2002. On June 29, 2020, he received Professor P.C. Mahalabi's National Award in Official Statistics in Lifetime Achievement category for the year 2020. This is in recognition of numerous distinguished and outstanding contributions he made to the Indian statistical system. In August 2021, Dr. Rangarajan received Professor C.R. Rao Centenary Gold Medal, instituted to commemorate his contributions to quantitative economic theory and practice, along with Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, Professor of Economics, Law and International Relations of the world-renowned Columbia University, for their lifetime contributions to the field of theoretical and applied aspects of quantitative economics and official statistics. He is one of the architects of the economic reforms in India, introduced 30 years ago in 1991, and written extensively on it, as well as the economic consequences of COVID-19 and monetary policy. He will be delivering 3 lectures, as you all know. One today on 3 decades of economic reforms, the second on growth and policy coordination in the context of COVID-19 on 17th, finally the third on evolving contours of monetary policy on 24th December, all at 12:30 p.m. These lectures are part of MBA second semester course on macroeconomics here in this university. We focus on applications in our curriculum to supplement the theories in every course and thus make the curriculum socially relevant. That is the basic objective in the university. Curriculum should be socially relevant. These lectures focus on the applications of the macroeconomics taught in the course. We are very fortunate to listen from you, sir, who was involved in the policy formulation in the government for about 2 decades. There is no substitute so that hands-on experience of working with the government on policy matters. And you have achieved long years of experience working with the government. That's the greatest asset, and that is the benefit we get now. I would like to spend a minute on the issues relating to economic reforms, which is the topic of today's lecture. What is the genesis of economic reforms? That's the most important question. Number 2, what has been the performance since the liberalization of reform process, both in economic growth and social development, reduction in poverty and inequality, employment and benefits to all sections of society? Number 3, there are various sectors: agriculture, industry, trade, finance, banking, capital markets, and factor markets. What should be the sequencing of reforms? Number 4, finally, have reforms resulted in increased efficiency in working of the economy? That's crucial test. Finally, what is the future path of reforms? Without much ado, I request Professor Rangarajan to address. He will speak for about 40-45 minutes, followed by question answers. The question and answer session will be through chat box. I therefore request you to enter your questions in the chat box. We will take them up and I will do the moderation and we will put the questions clubbing some questions are separate. Without much ado, I now request Professor Rangarajan to address. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Mahendra Reddy. The current year, 2021, marks the completion of 30 years since the economic reforms were launched in 1991. 1991 is an important landmark in the post-independence economic history of the country. In that year, the country faced an acute economic crisis triggered by a severe balance of payments problem. But the crisis was converted into an opportunity to bring about some fundamental changes in India's economic policy. In response to the crisis, two sets of policies were put in place. One was stabilization, and the other is structural reforms. Stabilization policies were aimed at correcting the weaknesses that have developed or the excesses that have developed in the area of balance of payments and fiscal management. Structural reforms were aimed at removing the rigidities that have developed into the system over the years. In the 1950s and 60s, the dominant view in the literature was that the government had an important role to play and that it must undertake activities to correct what came to be described as market failure. Market failure essentially means the inability of the markets to perform their function. This inability to perform the required functions was felt particularly in the area of investment, that is, allocation of resources over time, because of the myopic character of the participants. But the inability of the participants to look ahead over the next several decades could result in the investment proposals not being pushed through. Therefore, in the field of allocation of investment, the markets may not be able to function effectively. Therefore, at the same time, the literature also talked about the benefit that comes from initiating a set of coordinated and consistent projects at the same time. It is this line of thinking which led to the adoption of nationwide economic planning, not only in India, but in many other countries in the world. But 4 decades, or let us say even 5 decades of development experience have clearly shown that that can be government failure as well. The government failure may come because of not only the mistakes made in making the correct decisions with respect to investment, but also because of the diversion of resources into rent-seeking activities because of the regulations themselves. Therefore, what our development experience over the last 5 to 6 decades clearly shows is that there can be both government failure as well as market failure. The question, therefore, is not one of whether government should intervene in economic activities, but one of what the role of the intervention should be and what the extent of that intervention should be. The new economic policy initiated in 1991 builds on this premise. Looking back, one can say that it may not be fair to find fault with the leaders and with the policymakers in the 1950s and 60s in taking the decision they took at that time. At that particular point in time, there was no clear way indicating what the developing economies should take in order to accelerate growth. There was, however, the example of Soviet Union, as it was called then, which over a period of 3 to 4 decades achieved a high rate of growth and under a system in which the state played an important role and adopted economic planning as a tool to achieve the objectives. But the problem was that by the beginning of the 1970s, it was clear that the model that we had adopted was not delivering the goods. But then we did not make an effort to reverse the process. And we also recall that it was in 1978, December, that Deng Xiaoping in China made the big move to make a change in China's policy. On December 13, 1978, he talked about and wanted to explore new ways and generate new ideas. Thus, our change happened in 1991. The change in China happened in 1980. Thus, we were 1 decade behind China in terms of introducing reforms. Many people do not know that in 1980, India's per capita income in dollar terms was more or less equal to the per capita income of China in dollar terms. But by 2020, China's per capita income is 5.5 times higher than that of India. Let's get back a little bit to the background to the crisis. In the 1980s, India's balance of payment situation was under stress, particularly towards the end of the 1980s. In 1988-89, the current account deficit was 2.7% of the GDP. 1989-90, the current account deficit was 2.3% of GDP. And the immediate trigger for a severe balance of payments problem was the Iraq-Kuwait crisis, the war, which resulted in the price of dollar per barrel, the price of crude oil per barrel went up from $20 to $30. And the oil import price of the oil import bill of India went up from $3.8 billion to $6 billion. Therefore, what we faced in 1990 was an acute balance of payments crisis. Because of the high level of current account deficit, which went up to 3% of GDP in 1990-91, and the inability to finance that current account deficit. We were not able to roll over short-term credit. And NRI deposits, which were a source of inflow, which were a source of strength to India, went the other way around, and there was withdrawal of NRI deposits. I will not go into all the details. All that I will say is that by December 1990, India's foreign exchange reserves had fallen so low that it was hardly equal to 3 weeks' imports. Faced with this situation, the government had to make certain key decisions, and that constituted the economic reforms. Of course, there was change of government in 1990, more than twice, and then the new government under the leadership of Narasimha Rao took place in the middle of 1991. There were important decisions to be taken immediately, like the devaluation of the rupee. Earlier, we had even to ship gold out of India in order to obtain a certain level of loan from certain institutions, Bank of England and Bank of Japan. So it was this, against this background, that a decision had to be taken what the future is going to be. The new approach can be spelled out in this way. There is a common thread running through all the measures introduced since 1991. And that is to improve the productivity and efficiency of the system by injecting a greater element of competition. Therefore, the barriers to entry and growth were dismantled. The changes in industrial policy were meant to increase the domestic competitiveness of Indian firms, and the changes in the foreign trade policy were aimed to improve the external competitiveness of the Indian firms, subject, of course, to the tariffs which are being brought down step by step. Thus, the objective was to improve the productivity and efficiency of the system. And that is sought to be achieved by increasing the degree of competition in the system. The idea is to improve the productivity and the efficiency of the firms that were operating both in the private sector and in the public sector. But as part of the new economic policy, some of the areas which were exclusively reserved for the state sector were also thrown open to the private sector, such as aviation, steel, and so on. But there is nothing in the new economic policy which takes away the role of the state. It has not necessarily abridged the role of the state. It has expanded the role of the state in some areas. It has reduced the role of the state in some other areas. As was critically remarked, more markets did not mean less government, but different government. The role of the government in the provision of public goods and services, like primary education, health, and other basic needs have to be met by the government. Therefore, the responsibility of the government in these areas became larger than before. Thus, to summarize, the break with the past happened in three important directions. One, the new economic policy dismantled the wide network of regulations and controls which dominated the economy. As I mentioned earlier, the barriers to entry and growth were removed. This essentially meant dismantling the system of industrial licenses and controls. Therefore, where to produce, how to produce, what to produce were left to the entrepreneurs. That is the first important break with the past. The second break with the past was redefining the role of the state. As I mentioned earlier, the role of the state in areas in which markets can function effectively or markets can be regulated and made to function effectively were left to the private sector. Only in areas where the markets may not actually function effectively, the state has to intervene. And third, and the most important break with the past was to move away from a system or policy of import substitution to a new status in which India decided to open up and become an integral part of the worldwide system of the movement of goods and services. This is indeed a very important change that occurred. The importance of this decision can be seen from the fact that previously, whenever we had acute balance of payments problems, the solution to it was really to impose more controls on imports. But breaking away from that past, the government decided to have a trade policy which looked at India integrating with the rest of the world and then isolating itself. And that's an important decision. There are some questions about the genesis of reforms. People ask what was the role of Narasimha Rao, who was the prime minister. Everyone knows the role of Dr. Manmohan Singh, who, as a finance minister, initiated the reform process through his budget presented in 1991. But he also, Dr. Manmohan Singh, steered the economy in the new direction. But Narasimha Rao was not a reluctant reformer. He was an ardent advocate of reforms. Please remember that at the time when the new policy was being initiated, Narasimha Rao was also in charge of industry. And one of the important elements in the reform process was the dismantling of the controls and licenses that dominated the industrial system. Then there are people who ask the question, were the policies of 1991 a continuation of what was happening already in the 1980s? Or is it really a break? Certainly, the 1980s did see initiative of some new thought, particularly in the area of international trade. The Alexander Committee and later on the Abid Hussain Committee did talk about the need for promoting exports and the need for creating a more efficient and cost-effective economy in the country. But they were all small steps taken in the context of a system in which controls persisted. But in 1991, I think it was a bold step to move away from a network of controls that dominated the system. So the other question that is being asked, I'm summarizing all of this because we don't have the time to discuss all of this in great detail. The other one that is being asked is, were not the political leaders and the administrators part of a system earlier which emphasized controls? And how did the mindset change immediately? As having been part of the team which initiated and monitored the reforms in the early period, I can say that it became obvious in 1991 that business as usual cannot continue. The crisis that we faced was so severe and so deep that it required taking action in a totally different way. And that is why we adopted the new set of reforms. I cannot go into the various reforms that were introduced at that time. And let me give you a quick listing of the reforms that were introduced early and that were introduced later. Because one thing that has happened is that the reform program was accepted not only by the government which was in power in 1991, but also by all the governments who came subsequently also. The initial reforms included a reform of the fiscal system, both in terms of curtailing fiscal deficit and also in bringing about a change in the tax system by reducing the tax rates at the higher income slabs. A monetary policy went through a gamut of big changes with which I was associated as governor of the Reserve Bank at that time, included bringing to an end the automatic monetization of the fiscal deficit, dismantling the interest rate structure, reducing the cash reserve ratio and the statutory liquidity ratio, making the government raise funds through the market, through the mechanism of auctions. In the field of banking, introducing prudential norms such as capital adequacy ratio, recognition of income, and so on. And also opening up the banking system for new entrants, reforming the supervisory system by setting up a board for financial supervision, and so on. And as I mentioned earlier, another important changes was in the trade policy, allowing a free trade, but with the tariffs being brought down steadily over a period of time. Also, we allowed for the first time the foreign investors to come into India not only as a majority holder, not only as a minority holder, but also as a majority holder. Then we also allowed the flow of funds into the stock market in India by the foreign institutional investors. And more importantly, the exchange rate regime underwent a big change. And first we moved to a dual market system, and finally we went to a unified market system. So I can go on listing. The capital market was strengthened. Later on, the FRBM Act was introduced. Then we moved towards public-private participation, so that, as in the case of highways, and there could be a participation between the private parties laying the roads and the government giving them the opportunity to giving them the land so that the roads can be laid. And then, of course, later on, the introduction of GST. This is only a very short list. There is a very big list of reforms that have been introduced. Now, already asked, what has been the effect of the reforms? As they say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Did the growth rate accelerate after the reforms as compared to the previous period? For example, in India, between 1952 and 1980, the average rate of growth was 3.5%. Of course, in 1980 to 1990, the growth rate was higher at 5.6%. But then that period was marked, as I mentioned to you earlier, by a high current account deficit and by a high fiscal deficit, which resulted in the crisis of 1991, and to a stop and a steep decline in the growth rate in 91. If you look at the period from 92-93, 92-93 to 2000-2001, the average rate of growth was 6.2%. 2001-2 to 2010-11, it was 7.69. From 2011-12, it is 6.5 up to 2019-20. After that, of course, as you know, because of the COVID, it was a negative growth. Therefore, I'm not taking that into account. In fact, the best period was after 2005-6. Between 2005-6 and 2007-8, the average rate of growth of the economy was more than 9%. But if you add another 3 years also, the average rate of growth was 8.7%, and that included the year 2008-9, when we had the international economic crisis, the financial crisis. So on the whole, you will see the growth performance higher in the post-reform period. But then, since 2011-12, the growth rate has been falling. Now, there's one important difficulty in being able to analyze the data over a long period of time, because the new income data, new income series introduced with the base 2011-12 has made so many changes in the methodology that it completely upsets a good comparison between the period before it and the period after it. There are some people who feel that the new methodology has resulted in exaggerating the economic growth rate after 2011-12, particularly after 2-3 years later, because the 2011-12, the growth rate started declining even according to the old base. It is 2004-5. So there is some concern about the fall in the growth rate. In fact, under the old system itself, in 2012-13, the growth rate has fallen to 4.47%. After a peak of 9.9% plus in 2007-8, in 2012-3, the growth rate had fallen to 4.47%. Therefore, while growth does, while the higher growth rate does occur under the reforms, we need to take into account the fact that since 2011-12, for the next several years, the growth rate did fall. I'll come back to it later. Very quickly, the success story of the reforms is in the external sector. The current account deficit, which used to be high before, came down very substantially, and the current account remained in a very current account deficit was quite low. And because of the various actions taken to encourage the flow of funds, encourage the flow of investment into the country, that the foreign exchange reserves got built up to a very large extent. And today, we have foreign exchange reserves in excess of $600 billion. Therefore, there were one or two hiccups in the balance of payment situation. In 2011-12, we had a current account deficit of 4.3%. In 2012-13, we had a current account deficit of 4.8%. But since we had adequate reserves, we did not have to go to any external agency to obtain any help. We managed it. But as I said, we need to be careful about the way we manage the balance of payments situation. But by and large, it has been comfortable. Of course, in the more recent period, exports were negative in 2020-21. That was because of the fact that COVID-19 affected not only India, but also the rest of the world. And therefore, India's exports did fall in 2021. But in the current year, 21-22, Indian exports are doing well. Therefore, I would say by and large, the BOP has been good. The other area is that people always say, all right, growth might have happened, but has the benefit of growth been spread out, and whether all communities or all sections did benefit as a result of the growth. Now, there are several ways of measuring the impact of growth on the society. One can compute a Gini coefficient to look at the nature of the inequality in income. But one thing one can really look at is a measurement of the poverty ratio. I want to mention that if you look even the period 93-94 to 2011-12, it breaks into two periods. 93-94 to 2004-5, when we had the consumption expenditure surveys. And 2011-12, we had also the consumption expenditure surveys. In the latter period, when between 2004-5 and 2011-12, when the per capita income increased by 6.7%, as against 4.3% in the previous period, 93-94 to 2004-5, the poverty ratio fell from 45.3% to 37.2% in the first period. That is reduced by about 8% in the poverty ratio. But whereas in the second period, 2004-5 to 2011-12, it came down from 37.2% to 21.9%, according to the Tendulkar methodology. Therefore, the annual rate of decline was 0.7% in the previous period and 2.18% in the second period. What I would like to say is that if there is high rate of growth in the economy, then it does help to bring about or to bring a reduction in the poverty ratio. It does so in two ways. One, when growth is high, like the level that we had seen, about 8%, then it percolates to all sections. Secondly, when the growth rate is high, then the resources that the government can raise also goes up. And therefore, that can be utilized in order to build up more social safety nets in the economy. In the latter period, or the period during which we were able to introduce rural employment guarantee scheme, we had the extended food security system, and so on. As a result of it, you find that the poverty ratio coming in. You can ask the question, what happens now? I'm afraid because of the fall in the rate of growth in the economy since 2011-12, and more particularly because of the COVID-19, there is a possibility the poverty ratio may have gone up because the growth rate has been lower. Therefore, we need to focus very clearly that we have to really ensure the high rate of growth in the economy. Whether we do the analysis through headcount poverty ratio or even use a multiple poverty indicator index, both tell the same story, that in the high growth period, poverty did come down in India. And therefore, you need two things in order to reduce the poverty ratio. One, a high rate of growth in the economy. Two, supported, that this high rate of growth in the economy should be supported by appropriate measures to take care of the interests of the vulnerable sections. This takes me to the last segment of what I want to say. What is the future of reforms? As I mentioned, if you look at the growth performance, had the growth rate continued to run at the same level after 2011-12 in the same way it had been before, then we would have a unique answer to the question whether the reforms have actually led to higher growth. But actually, the growth rate fell after 2011-12. There are many reasons for it, some of which is cyclical, some of which is non-economic, which led to the fall in the growth rate. Therefore, growth requires more than the reforms. As the economists are fond of saying, reforms are a necessary condition for economic growth, but not necessarily sufficient condition for growth. In fact, if you look at the investment rate, it fell by about almost 5 percentage points between the peak of 2007-8 and subsequently. Therefore, we need to nurture the investment rate. Only by nurturing the investment rate, along with the reforms, we can achieve a higher growth. Normally, reforms create a good climate for investment. After all, the very purpose of reform is to improve the productivity and efficiency of the system. And therefore, investment rate should be high. But investment, or sometimes people call the animal spirits, are also influenced by non-economic factors. Therefore, even as we go ahead with reforms, we also need to be very careful, and we need to ensure that the focus on investment and other contributory factors to growth are also taken care of. So the first point that I would make is reforms do not automatically lead to growth. In order to achieve growth, we need to go beyond reforms. Second, the reform agenda must continue. What we had in 1991 is a paradigm shift from a controlled regime to a regime which is more liberal. We don't need a paradigm shift now. The reforms may now be incremental, but the basic philosophy of the reform is to ensure that competition prevails in every sector. Competition should lead to improved productivity and efficiency in the system. Therefore, what we need to do at this particular point is to look at every sector of the economy and see which sectors need reforms from the point of view of improving efficiency. Financial system, the power system, the power sector, governance, all these require reforms. In fact, agricultural marketing also requires reforms. The question is, how do we introduce it, with what degree of consent, and so on and so forth. And center and states must join hands together to introduce the reforms. So first, growth requires more than reforms. Two, the reform agenda must continue. It must look at each sector of the economy and introduce the measures to improve the competition in that system. Third, reforms do attract criticism. It is not new. Even in 1991, there were critics. There were people in the parliament who thought that we have sold ourselves to IMF or something like that. Because many people ask the question, are these reforms not identical with what IMF has been following? So these criticisms will come. Therefore, what we need now even more are there at the time of 1991, because several of those reforms could be introduced in 1991 under the shadow of a crisis. Now, we can't do that. Therefore, we need more discussion. We need consensus building. And therefore, as we move ahead with the reforms, a lot more concessions with all the stakeholders will be required. Four, timing and sequencing is also important. When I say timing, for example, labor reforms are best introduced at a time when the economy is growing fast. Because when labor reforms are introduced, there is always a concern what the impact of those reforms will be on the employment situation, on the tenure of the workers, and so on. Therefore, if that is to be avoided, there will be greater acceptance of the labor reforms when the economy is on the upswing. Therefore, timing is that important. For example, even in this reforms on agricultural marketing, even under the earlier government, there were attempts to improve the functioning of the agricultural marketing APMCs. Perhaps APMCs are better monitored and steered by the state governments. And that will give you a clear example of what is very often called natural experiments. Some states may adopt certain measures, some may not adopt the other measures, and then we will be able to figure out which of the states has functioned better. Therefore, timing, sequencing are also critically important. In recent period, there have been talks about India achieving the level of $5 trillion. Immediately before the advent of COVID-19, India's GDP was at $2.7 trillion. On some assumptions relating to exchange rate and others, and also inflation, it will take the economy to grow at 9% per annum for 5 years consecutively to achieve that level. Therefore, we need to grow strongly if you have to build up a strong economy. Reforms are needed to improve efficiency and productivity of the system. As I said earlier, reforms help to grow strongly. But reforms are not ends in themselves. They must also lead to growth and equity. Reform measures should be supplemented by efforts to take care of the vulnerable and weaker sections of the society. So growth with equity should be the objective. But reforms are an integral part of that particular program. Growth and equity should not be posed as opposing considerations. Both are needed. But equity will remain a dream if it is not supplemented or supported by growth spurred by reforms. Therefore, reforms, growth, and equity form a trinity which we must try to achieve. Thank you very much.
Sir, thank you very much, sir, for your excellent lecture. You know, it was fantastic. You have covered so many points. You have covered the logic, the genesis of the reforms. You have spent a good deal of time, which is very important for the students to know why we went for reforms. And you have mentioned about the various reforms in industry and trade, essentially as to how they can help improve the competitiveness in the domestic economy as well as global competitiveness. Next, you went on to the results. You analyzed the results, what the growth was before the reform period, 1950 to 80, the 3.5% rate of growth, and how during 90 to 2001 and subsequently, we achieved a much higher rate of growth, thereby giving the information that the reforms have resulted in a higher rate of growth. And you have rightly pointed out that the reforms are necessary but not sufficient. We may not require paradigm shift now, but we require incremental changes to continue to maintain high growth of growth. And you have cautioned that the $5 trillion economy, which we want to achieve, we want to realize, will require that the economy grows at about 9% continuously without any break for 5 years to achieve that goal. And most important thing of reforms for the benefit of students, I would say, is increased efficiency in the economy, increased productivity in the economy. That's the fundamental question we ask. And most important is growth and equity should go together and not just only growth, because the benefit of growth should go not to go for a few people, but a larger spread in the society, a reduction in poverty, reduction in the inequalities in the distribution of income. I think that it has been a fantastic lecture, been very educative. Now we'll have a few questions. We have put it in terms of several questions. What kind of reforms are required in the health sector and the education sector to realize the growth? Because both are important to realize our demographic dividend. And similarly, what reforms are needed in the farm sector to improve the share of the agriculture sector in the GDP, and we want the farmers to be better off as a result. Sir, would you like to take these two questions? There are a couple of more questions. How do you want us to?
Well, now let me, as I mentioned earlier, that more market does not mean less government, but different government. And I also emphasized there that in the provision of what is called public goods and services, the role of the state continues to remain important. In fact, it becomes even more important. Therefore, in terms of health and education, the role of the state continues to remain important. The basic thing is the provision of additional facilities in these two areas becomes critically important because they are basic to improving the productivity of the system. Good health and good education are the essential attributes that must go with the youth so that they can perform well and add to the productivity of the system. Therefore, one thing that people have been talking about is that the expenditure of the state and this and the center taken together on education should be about 6.6%, 6% of the GDP. We are now somewhere around 4.4%. Therefore, a larger expenditure is required. But the point essentially in the case of service sector is like health and education. It is not simply the expenditure. It is the efficiency with which that expenditure is being incurred. Here we are not measuring productivity in terms of an output as in the case of an industrial enterprise. Here, what we are really looking at is whether the services are to be made available, whether in the field of education or in the field of health, is adequately provided for. Therefore, we need to increase government expenditures in the field of health and education, but at the same time, we need to focus on the delivery system. What improvements can be made in the delivery system? There are people who are experts in the field of higher education, primary education, and others who have talked about what needs to be done in education. There are equally people who have talked about the health services. Therefore, What is essentially needed is a combination of the private sector and the government sector. The role of the government sector will continue to remain important in the two areas that you have mentioned, namely health and education. Now, on agriculture, there is, as I mentioned, agricultural marketing also requires reforms in the sense that ultimately the farmer must get the benefit of the prices that are being paid by the consumers. Therefore, from the beginning, people have been talking about the need to reduce the role of the middlemen in terms of appropriating a greater part of the prices that are being paid by the consumers. Therefore, agricultural marketing becomes important. APMC is a good, if it is well operated, it's a good institution because it makes very transparent the transactions. But at the same time, perhaps the farmers must also be given the option to be able to sell to others. Therefore, what is really required is clearly agricultural marketing system, which gives to the farmer the major share of what the consumers pay. That is the direction in which we should move, just as Amul, for example, has done for in the field at dairy, needs to be done in the other areas. But productivity has to go up. That is where a real problem comes in. The average land holding has been steadily coming down. I don't exactly remember the number, but the average land holding is not more than about 2 to 2.5 acres of land. Now, in that, or perhaps even less, and in that small piece of land, it is very difficult for anybody to get a level of income which is adequate. Therefore, we need to think in terms of consolidation of the land holdings in order to be able to enable the farmers to get the benefits of the scale of operations. Therefore, there is in the field of production and productivity, we need to move in the direction of consolidation of land holdings in order to enable the farmers to get the benefit of a larger, of a higher scale of operations. In marketing, I would say we need to think more in terms of Amul type solution to enable the small farmers and others to get a higher share of what the consumers pay.
So we have two questions related. One is what reform is required to reduce income and wealth disparities, and the second one is relating to one criticism against reform is income and wealth inequalities have increased since 1991. Is this true? What reforms are required to reduce these inequalities?
Well, I had mentioned earlier about the poverty ratio coming down. As I said, inequality can be measured in a number of ways. Inequality measurement such as the Gini coefficient looks at the entire spectrum of income and its distribution. There are some studies which show that inequality in income has increased. But earlier studies up to the period of 2011-12 did not show that much of an increase in inequality in income. Since then, as I told you earlier, the rate of growth of the economy has been coming down, and that has actually resulted in perhaps in a rise. Now, obviously, if you measure the inequality in income post-COVID or during the COVID period, you will come up with a situation where the inequality in income has increased, because when COVID-19 hit us hard in 2021, a large number of wage earners were affected. The migrant labor, which is not a small number, which is a big number of people, had to give up their jobs and had to go back to their villages. Therefore, in the measurement of income inequality during these 2 years would have been worse. I mean, I have no reason to believe that it can be anything other than that. But basically, what I say is that if we have a high rate of growth in the economy, and if that high rate of growth in the economy is supplemented by measures such as the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, extended food security, and so on, then the number of people who may be described as poor can come down. I think the Tendulkar Committee came to the conclusion that the poverty ratio in 2011-12 was 21% or 21.99% as compared to 45.3% in 93-94. Now, this a number clearly indicates that if you have growth supplemented by social safety net measures, the poverty ratio can be brought down.
So, what is the evidence after 2011-12? After?
As I said, that we first of all, we don't have we have not done a proper survey after 2011-12. Perhaps after everything settles down, we should do another consumption expenditure survey properly. This is not the occasion to discuss in length, but about what needs to be done about the consumption expenditure survey. If you do that, it really then we can look at what needs to be done. I mean, in order to bring down the ratio. Actually, the Oxford study on multiple indicator index clearly shows that a significant proportion of the people has come out of poverty. So there are studies which also show that kind of a result.
So the last question, you have dealt at great length on how reforms help improve efficiency in the economy, how reforms help improve productivity. Which sectors have shown better results as a result of the reforms? Which sectors are lagging? And how do we rectify this remedy? Yeah, what is the remedy for this?
Now, I think it is generally believed that if there is greater competition in the system and less of a monopoly or oligopoly situation, efficiency improves. There are people who measure productivity through various methods and techniques. In fact, one good indicator of improvement in efficiency is what happens to exports. Because in the case of exports, the ability to export more clearly underlines or is clearly the result of improved efficiency in the economic situation. Therefore, our performance on exports in the recent period have been reasonably good. I mean, it's not all not in all years. Therefore, the direct studies on the productivity in various industries have been done, but some of the results are mixed. They are not very clear that the productivity has actually improved as a consequence. But the fact of the matter is that when large foreign investment is coming into the various sectors of the economy, the foreigner or the foreign investor, foreign real investment, direct investment as we call it, foreign direct investment will not come into the country unless that foreign investor finds the system here is reasonably efficient. Otherwise, there is no reason why a foreign direct investment should come to India. The fact that the foreign direct investment is going up is an indirect indicator of the fact that there is improvement in the productivity.
This is an excellent way of analyzing, using data relating to foreign direct investment, increase in investments, and therefore it is an evidence of increased efficiency in the economy in several sectors. I think if there are no other questions, I would like to thank you, sir, for your excellent lecture. So many aspects have been covered, and the entire student community and the faculty, we have immensely benefited. And we meet again for the second lecture. Second lecture will be on 17th of December, same time at 12:30. The growth and policy coordination in the context of COVID-19, you have already mentioned about it, but it's an important topic. Growth and policy coordination in the context of COVID-19 on 17th, same at 12:30, and probably the link is provided already. Am I right? The link has already been provided. Thank you, sir, very much. And this concludes the lecture. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Hello?
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you. I hope it went off well.
Yes, extremely well. It was very educative.
Yeah.